Hi, this is Randal Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Simon Phipps joins me to talk about open source software at, get this, at the U.S. Department of Defense. Pretty surprising stuff. You'll want to hear about this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randal Schwartz and Simon Phipps. Episode 160 for April 6th, 2011. Open source software at the Department of Defense. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies streamed to your PC, Mac, or TV instantly. Plus, get DVDs by mail in about one business day. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randal Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the small projects, the thinkers, the doers, everything all the way across the spectrum. But I'm often aided by a very competent person, but we couldn't find one this week. No, just kidding. We'll bring on my co-host, Simon Phipps. Simon, welcome back to the show.
It's a pleasure to be back here, Randal. It's 20 degrees centigrade here in the UK. I've broken out the Hawaiian shirt and the cocktails, and I'm trying not to smirk too much at the people in the icy wastes of coastal America, particularly on the east at the moment. So I'm trying to think, is 20 like freezing or boiling? I'm not sure, being from the U.S. It's kind of warm, you know. It's in the 70s, you know.
Kind of warm. Okay, that'll work. Simon, I just found out that we're going to be physically in the same place once again. Do you know where that is? I
don't know where that is. Where is it going to be, Randal?
It's going to be
am I going on a cruise?
Somewhere below the equator, maybe down in the Brazilian area.
Oh, right. So you're going to Fisley, are you?
Yeah, I guess we're both going to be at Fisley this year. Yep. I've been accepted as one of the keynote speakers, just like you. I saw you there on the page, and I thought, oh my God, I'm actually going to get to see Simon in the flesh again for a change.
Maybe we could record a FLOSS Weekly down in Brazil.
Oh, that would be cool. I'll have to practice my Portuguese.
Well, I think we should actually have one in a churrascaria, drinking caipirinhas with dancing girls going on in the room. Okay, that may be a bit distracting, but maybe we'll work something out. Well, the show is not about. Yeah, this show's not about you and me. It's about our guests, and this week we have a really interesting guest. Unlike most of the times when I'm bringing on a project and having a project leader talk about the project, this time the guest that we have is none other than David Wheeler, David A. Wheeler, he likes to be known as, because there's other David Wheelers out there. David Wheeler is an expert, so he claims anyway, and we'll check this out, on how open source software is being used in the U.S. Department of Defense. Now, when I first saw this topic, I went, the DoD is using open source software. Then I thought about, yeah, I guess it would have to, because there's a lot of really cool things out there in the open source communities, and why not use that alongside all the rest of the software that they procure and spend my tax dollars on? In fact, maybe that's actually an advantage because you're not spending all that money on it. So I've got a lot of questions I want to ask him to have him on the show. And Simon, you've got some questions you probably want to ask him too? Absolutely. You know, I'd be very interested to talk to David about the work that he's been doing in the DoD, to the extent that he'll talk to me, being a non-resident alien working for a suspect foreign power. But I'll be very interested to find out what steps he's been able to take in socializing open source software in the DoD. I think there's a lot that can be learned from him by other governments, and the example he's got there. And David, of course, is very well known in the free and open source software community for his involvement in all sorts of things, not least that he did a controversial talk at the NASA Open Source Summit last week. I'll be quite interested to hear about that from him too.
Very good, very good. But before we bring him on, I have to thank two different groups or organizations. Thank you again to Media Temple for providing the hosting place, not the hosting place, the space for me to actually do this podcast in. They give me a room all to myself here, and they even gave me this really wonderful mic if you're watching on the video. But also, we have a sponsor this week, and I love this sponsor. This is one of my favorite things to be interacting with. We have Netflix as a sponsor, and I have a little bit I have to read here about Netflix, and it's not coming up. There we go. Okay, so this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought brought to you by Netflix. Netflix delivers movies directly to your home, and it saves you time, money, and hassle. You can instantly watch thousands of TV episodes and movies streamed directly to your Windows machine or Mac machine. They say PC here in the copy, but PCs include Mac, so I don't know why it says PC. Or stream to your TV via Netflix-ready device, including the Xbox 360, PS3, and Nintendo Wii. And you can also get DVDs by mail in about 1 business day. You watch as many movies as you want, anytime you want. There are never any late fees or due dates. And so you can basically, I'm a happy Netflix user. I have Netflix on my laptop when I'm in my hotel rooms. I watch that instead of watching the crummy cable TV they always have. I also have it on my iPhone, so I've actually been I've been in a bus going down the freeway and also down on the train. I've been watching Netflix right there on my iPhone. I also have a Roku at home. It comes right to there. I also have a PlayStation 3. Comes directly to there. So I'm a very happy customer. I have something like 450 movies and television shows in my queue to watch. So I've got plenty of stuff to watch for the next 9 months. I could watch continuously and still not run out of stuff. So no, we do have a special offer. If you want to watch any movie or any of the thousands of TV shows that are provided by Netflix, you can actually get a free trial membership. If you go to netflix.com/twit, TWIT, you can get a 1-month free membership. And I would really encourage you to test it out, mostly in the U.S. So if you're international, you might not have as big a selection, but go check it out. Definitely. I'm a happy Netflix user, and you can be too. So now that further ado, let's go ahead and bring on our guest.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Great. And where are we speaking to you from? Are you in some secret bunker somewhere?
Nah, I'm in Northern Virginia. I'm actually at my house right now, but I work not far from here.
Very cool. Well, we brought you on today to talk about one of your favorite subjects. But I gave sort of a brief overview of what I knew about the subject area of having open source software at the Department of Defense at the beginning of the show, but I probably did a really horrible job. Since you're the expert on it, can you give us sort of like what's the big deal about the open source software at the Department of Defense?
Well, I guess the big deal is that the Department of Defense uses a heck of a lot of open source software. It releases open source software, and it's perfectly fine to do so. And a lot of people in other government agencies and other governments still think that that's somehow impossible or some sort of big problem. And it's not a big problem.
So why would people think it's a big problem? Let's start from that, and we'll kind of spiral into how it actually works out.
Okay. Actually, a lot of problems turn out to hinge on just problems of people have to follow various rules and regulations and fine inside the government. And the problem is when they look at these, their minds kind of go tilt because a lot of them weren't written with open source in mind. Mm-hmm. And there's some other problems that kind of misconceptions, it can't be secure, which is of course nonsense, or anything else like that. So and I think a whole lot of it just comes down to, believe it or not, unfamiliarity. I think you and I, of course, know open source has been around for a long time, but sadly, a lot of people are still kind of waking up to that. So I think a lot of the problem inside the DoD, it turns out DoD never had any restrictions or prohibitions on it. The problem has been more at the 12 layers down, people making false assumptions and ignoring stuff that they should have been using or considering at least.
Well, let's back up just a little bit here. Some people especially from other countries, might not be aware of just what the relationship the DoD has with, say, government contractors and stuff. But how does software ever end up in something inside the DoD in the first place, and how does open source software affect that process?
Okay, fair enough. But by the way, let me pound include standard disclaimer. I'm not speaking for the DoD, but that
neither am I.
Oh, good. But basically, sometimes a government employee who works for the Department of Defense actually writes the software that gets used. But actually, that's very much a minority. Most of the time, what happens is the Department of Defense wants to get something done. It will either create a new contract or use an existing contract and modify it, and then hire out a contractor to actually do the work, who may in fact hire out a subcontractor to do pieces of the other work and so on. And so in bigger projects, it can often be several tiers of a contractor and the subcontractor and subcontractor all developing pieces of a larger system that the DoD uses. And that's not, by the way, unique to the DoD. That's true for U.S. government in general, and I believe many other governments, at least Western governments, do the same kind of thing.
Okay, so they in order to have this happen, they put out some sort of bid, right? They have to have some sort of specification, and who's allowed to submit to that bid? Is it just anybody, any company or any individual, or are there restrictions on that?
It depends on the company, on the contract. Sometimes it's fairly open, sometimes it's not. The bigger ones often you end up tending to, in many cases, getting a lot of the same DoD contractors, because for the big contracts, the folks who are familiar with how the DoD works and the rules often end up being the ones being the bidders. But in fact, that's one of the issues, is that I think the DoD would like to see more competition, more people bidding on these things, because with more competition, results tend to be better.
And how vague or how specific are these requests for proposals, the RFPs? Do they drill down all the way down to saying it must run on Windows and it must interface with these 3 databases? Or is it more just we need some sort of data management software? Or maybe it's everything and all that in between?
I think the honest answer is it depends, which I realize is kind of a wimpy answer, but really sometimes it's very specific and sometimes it's rather vague. They usually try to at least identify, it has to connect with these components and so on, but it varies a lot. Okay, and so I might, as a software contractor, which I actually am, might see one of these proposals somewhere in some published place online. I hope that I can see this. And I might say, well, I know it'll fit that. I know that either some standard CPAN software from Perl, or maybe this looks like a FreeBSD machine would fit the specification for this. Right now, is there anything stopping me from fulfilling the bid if there's nothing literally in the bid to use open source software then for that? Nothing at all, actually. And this is actually one of the challenges, is that the DoD, it sends out these proposals saying, hey, please propose stuff to us. But when people don't look at it and say, oh, wait a minute, I could use these open source software components, they don't get included, even if that would have been the better, cheaper way, because they're just not considered. And this is actually a more general problem. The DoD is trying to get people to consider all these things, but the folks who are actually doing the contracting don't always do so.
Well, that would seem like a sort of a misuse of my dollars. And if a bid can be fulfilled with things that are available off the shelf and free, rather than having to go out and buy commercial licenses, say for Oracle or for Windows or whatever to do something, it sounds like it would actually be a benefit for everyone to start considering open source software for this stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Which in fact the DoD is trying to address that. So I guess at this point I ought to point out to folks. First of all, if you're inside the DoD, of course this is directly relevant. But even if you aren't involved directly with it, it's probably worth pointing out that the Department of Defense released in 2009 a policy trying to address some of these problems, and you can blame me because I actually helped write the thing. And we tried to at least address some of these misconceptions. So how's this? Let me pull out a dead tree copy here. I wanted to have a prop. So here's my prop. Of course, nobody can see it. But the title is Clarifying Guidance Regarding Open Source Software. And it tries to clarify this sort of stuff. So maybe what I should do is just kind of not read it to you, but just kind of walk through some of the points. And,
pick up the bullet points. Let's hear about that.
Yeah, and let me pull some of the bullet points, and then we can kind of discuss it as we go along.
Sure.
A lot of this stuff, the first half of the page is just who it's sent to, so you kind of have to be familiar with how you read these things. But when you go in the back and get the actual meat, it's got a couple points. The first one, actually, let's see, here's A, if you're looking in the back here on page 4. Basically, it says, open source software is almost always commercial software. And that actually kind of surprises a lot of people. But if you go look at, for example, the U.S. government actually defines what commercial items mean. And it says if it's licensed to the public and there's at least one non-government use, it's commercial. Even if it's modified, it's commercial. And that's by law. So wow, what that means, of course, is that almost all the open source software is commercial, and that's really important because it turns out that there are rules about commercial software. In particular, the contractors are supposed to always look for the commercial software, and if they're appropriate, they're supposed to prefer them.
So the definition of commercial here, I just want to make sure that I'm clear. The definition of commercial here isn't commercial in the sense that I'm thinking about it, and maybe a lot of other people now listening are, which is that it has to do with monetary exchange, but rather the realm of users for software defines whether it's commercial or not.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, let's see here. I've even got the U.S. Those of you who are lawyers, 10 U.S.C. 2377. Isn't that sad? I've got that here. Now, what's interesting, by the way, is that that's the part about government contracts. But it turns out if you go look at the copyright law, and by the way, I'll have to give credit to Linus Torvalds, who pointed this out. It turns out the copyright law says that financial gain just means you were either receiving or hoping to receive anything else in exchange, including copyrighted work. So simply by creating an open source project with the hope that you're going to get some stuff back, that's financial. So they're actually thinking of that as a financial gain. And again, it's commercial. Even if no money exchanges hands. Barter is still commercial, even if no money exchanges hands.
Interesting.
So, and so that turns, that kind of sounds like a little point, but because there's all these rules about preferring commercial software, and you're supposed to look at commercial software, knowing, oh, wait a minute, it met this definition, all of a sudden, the government folks, the contractors who before said, well, I don't know what this open source software is. I've got a bunch of rules I'm supposed to follow. What rules am I supposed to follow? Oh, it's just the commercial rules. They all apply. Keep going. And this actually frees them up from a lot of misunderstandings, because they already know how to handle commercial software. They just needed to know that open source was commercial also. So that's actually probably one of the biggest things. In fact, it's the first one, because that really just opens up all sorts of stuff, all sorts of possibilities on open source software. And by the way, I should note that this policy says all sorts of positive things about open source. It doesn't say you must always use it or that's the cure-all, but it certainly says some positive things. So that's probably one of the biggest points, is open source software is commercial. And even outside the government, I should point out, Red Hat's not a nonprofit, nor is Novell, nor are lots of other organizations who develop open source software. So, I mean, even for lots of other reasons, it's kind of silly to say open source software isn't commercial. Let's see. I was talking about the policy, though. Probably the next big thing, and this is a DoD unique thing, except I've since learned that lots of government agencies have copied this. The DoD has something about not using freeware, but then you have to go look at what do they mean by freeware, and they mean software where there's no source code and there's nobody who will fix it for them, because they want something maintained. Well, wait a minute. If freeware is stuff that isn't where there's no source code, obviously, open source software can't be freeware. No. Right. But this is one of those other words that just causes all sorts of trouble, needless trouble. And so by just clarifying, no, when we say freeware, it can't mean open source, because you've got the source code. You or other people could maintain it for you. So let's see. The next, I don't know if you had any comments, if you've heard that word freeware elsewhere used. Yes, no, I see a shaking head, yes.
Yeah.
Let's see here. A lot of these other things are really, again, kind of misunderstandings. Basically, you've got to have some way of maintaining the software. It's open source or not, they've got some way. But, there's lots of ways to maintain open source software. And there's a lot of misunderstandings, particularly about the GPL. It surprised people, but in fact, lots of commercial companies and the U.S. government release software under the GPL. And there's this strange idea that the GPL requires that every time you make a change, automatically it has to be pushed out to the public. That's never what the GPL said. It's much more specific than that. And so you have to actually read what it actually says. I guess that's probably the real issue, is that there's a lot of misunderstandings about the GPL. That's just one of them. And instead of hearing what people say, you should either look at something more authoritative or read the GPL itself. It's not that big, and certainly not that complicated to see what it really says. It turns out, by the way, that there's lots and lots of GPL software the DoD uses. It doesn't cause us any trouble. Linux is used all over. GCC is used all over. They're both GPL. No problem.
So I've been writing about this a bit recently, David. notably on the subject of procurement of open source software by governments. My experience over the last year has been that at the startup we've been getting going, it's the procurement departments that are screwed up, not the technical departments when it comes to these things. Have you found in the DoD that you've had to go and address the procurement rules to stop them asking for negotiable licenses and warranties and indemnities on free software? Because that's been the thing that's been hitting us every time is clueful technical departments and then clueless procurement departments.
The problem of clueless procurement departments is endemic the world around. I think actually the DoD is probably better than most, but that's also starting with a pretty low bar. And unfortunately, the procurement folks are supposed to be slightly knowledgeable about everything, which unfortunately leaves them not very knowledgeable about a lot of things. So yes, we've had to try to explain all sorts of things. The warranty thing is actually an interesting case. The DoD managed to write some text that I think that the saving grace is that DoD explained why it wanted it, and basically it said the DoD needs to be either repaired itself or have somebody else repair it, which actually is perfectly sensible. But the problem is that it was worded in a way that made people think, oh, wait a minute, you've got to have warranties everywhere. And we're still having the problem. The DoD policy at this top level, we're still trying to push it down to all the various departments and agencies and so on, who I think need to fix what they've got. It's not all consistent. And so we're very much working that, and I don't think we're unusual at all in that situation.
Certainly, looking in the UK, I see the UK government has stumbled over and over again on this very topic. That like we had a fine-sounding procurement policy from our previous government, who fundamentally ended up buying Microsoft software because, first of all, they were locked in all the way from here to hell, and secondly, because they had procurement policies that kept things that way. So I think it's true the world over that the procurement policies are the obstacle. Do you have something written down showing what steps you had to take to fix DoD procurement policies? Because that would be a very useful document to be able to show to the British government and to other governments who are struggling with this.
Well, I don't know about the process. Every government has its own process for doing policies anyway. But I think what's probably helpful is that the DoD's got an official policy, this clarifying guidance from 2009. And what they can do is go look at that and see what would be helpful for them. Not so much the process, but what have we said? And I said I'm not really speaking for the DoD, but what's the DoD say? And gee, can we copy that? Do those statements make sense for us too? I think actually a lot of these are statements that would make sense for a lot of folks. As far as the lock-in problem, that is a very serious issue. There's no simple answer to that. But I will say that one of the solutions for lock-in is basically stop thinking in terms of 1 or 2 years or maybe even 3 years ahead, because if you're locked in 10 years from now, no change, you'll still be locked in. And if you start calculating out, well, what's this going to cost me for 10 years if I can't change and they know that I can't change? In general, if there can't be competition, you're going to pay a heavy price. And most governments plan to be around in 10, 20 years. They should plan for the tools that they need to use to also be around that long. And I think if they started calculating the true cost, not just an annual cost, a lot of decisions would be different.
Right. So I was actually looking today at some questions in Parliament, again here in the UK, and we had a Cabinet Office minister, a guy called Ian Watmore, making a statement that said that, of course, open source software wasn't secure because the guys at GCHQ in the UK and there in Virginia, where you are, find that open source is much easier to hack. What would you say to Mr. Watmore if you had the opportunity to disabuse him of that line of thinking?
Oh, my goodness. A long list of things. Let me start with, first of all, what do they mean by hack? It turns out that there's still some people who've been I would say, misled by journalists who think the word hack is something much to do with breaking in. I mean, people sometimes use that word that way. But the old definition of hack is basically to understand and to deeply understand something, and in this case, to improve it. Open source software is easier to maintain, is what that says. Oh, wait, that's maybe not what you mean. Presumably what they really meant, though, is that open source software is easier to break into. And it's certainly true that just because it's open source, it's not automatically better. But a lot of open source software is really good from a security vantage point. A lot of open source software is quite secure. And in particular, I would point out, and I'm not unique, a lot of security experts point out that open source has a fundamental advantage. The basic principles for developing secure software were identified by Salzer and Schroeder back in the 70s. And one of the key ones is what's called open design. In other words, you better not depend on having that source code secret, because in fact it's going to be found out. Proprietary software gets broken into all the time by people who don't have the source code. They don't need it. The source code is more helpful for someone trying to repair it, not particularly for an attacker. So basically the advantage of open source software is that it's available for public peer review and mass peer review, which tends to produce better works. Peer-reviewed stuff isn't always better, but science, mathematics, in general, in the sciences and engineering, it's generally accepted that peer review produces better products. And not always, not guaranteed, but it definitely does tend to produce better works.
So how do you guarantee that peer review is going to take place, though, David? Because I mean, if you've got a project like a project that is run by a single vendor, for example, under an open source license, still the only people who actually are reviewing that are the vendor's staff. So it isn't always the case that there's peer review going on.
Oh, no, it's certainly not true that peer review always goes on. Now, just being a single vendor doesn't mean that no peer review is going on, by the way. A number of these projects which have a single leading vendor supplier still get lots and lots of peer review. But be that as it may, the way is to evaluate the software, which is in fact what you're supposed to be doing for any software. Before you bring in software that is going to be really important to you, that's going to be something you're really going to depend on. If it's proprietary, if it's open source, if you're going to write it yourself, you need to evaluate it and see if it's actually going to meet your needs. And in the case of open source software, what you should be doing is going back and looking, are people evaluating it? Are the problems that they're identifying getting fixed? Because all software is going to have problems occasionally. So, but are people looking for it? Are they fixing problems that they find? I actually wrote a little paper on how to evaluate open source software, and it's the same criteria you use for any software, but you actually have more information than you did other places.
Right.
You've got, and you can actually go look at it. And so it's actually, I would say, the converse. The transparency of a typical open source software development means that at least you have a fighting chance of determining, is this good, is this bad? A lot of proprietary software, it's not immediately obvious. You certainly can't watch them develop it to see if they're actually paying attention to the issues that you care about.
So the leading question has to be, are the NSA actually using open source software, David?
Let's see. What can I tell you? I don't think... Okay. The short answer is yes. Of course they are. And in fact, they're using quite a bit of open source software, like lots of other organizations. And there's I'm not revealing any grand secrets, by the way. They publish all. I should
tell you, I am a non-resident alien. You should be aware of that. I'm so non-resident. I'm not even in America at the moment.
Well, this is being posted to the world, so I've got to be careful what I say. But in this particular case, a lot of folks actually heard about something called Security Enhanced Linux. That was actually developed by the NSA as an extension to Linux to add additional security capabilities to Linux specifically. And why did they do that? Because they had they wanted additional capabilities, and Linux let them go and modify the software, but they didn't want to maintain it forever or anything like that. And so they contributed to the Linux kernel community, just like any other potential contributor, and people hemmed and hawed, and eventually it got in. I think that's, they had actually, that particular project's interesting because they'd actually spent a lot of time and a lot of money redeveloping operating systems from scratch that no one ever used, which is kind of sad when you think about it. And instead with that Linux work, anybody who uses Red Hat Enterprise Linux or CentOS or Fedora, almost anyone who uses it, at least by default, it comes with that turned on. And so there's lots and lots of people who are using that additional security capability because they were able to improve an open source software project.
Yeah, we actually had the guy from SU Linux, or one of the chief kind of overseers of it, on FLOSS Weekly a few weeks ago. I wasn't the host that time. I actually had to listen to the show, but it was a quite interesting show about how it really got from the NSA developing this back into the mainstream. And that actually leads me to a whole series of questions, which is how much can DoD, either contractors or people inside the DoD, participate as part of the community for these software pieces, or do they just simply use and squander for themselves the changes that they're making locally?
Okay. Actually, we talked about that policy. The very last part of the policy basically says, software items should be released to the public, such as an open source software license, when given the following conditions. And in fact, let me read the conditions because I think that's helpful. Yeah. The first one is, there are three conditions. The first one is that, the project manager, program manager, or some other official determines that's the government's interest to do so, such as through the expectation of future enhancements by others. So the DoD is actually not unique in this. Nobody wants to pay the costs of maintenance because maintenance is actually way more costly than initial development. So oftentimes it's in the government's interest to get that software that changes it's made back into the open source software project so that the other people can maintain it, not just the government all by itself. So there's got to be a reason to do so, but there is a kind of a built-in reason in many cases. Let's see. The second reason is the government has to have the rights to do so. And that's actually that turns out to be a lot trickier than you might think, I'm sorry to say. So here we go. I have another prop. Are you ready for another dead tree prop? Here we go. Sure. Okay, so here we go. Dead tree prop. This is DoD and open source software from DAX Software Tech. And in particular, I've got an article. Let's see if a camera can actually see anything here. Well,
those of you on the audio feed, you're not missing much.
That's right.
He's just holding up a magazine.
That's right. Basically, the title is called Publicly Releasing Open Source Software Developed for the U.S. Government. And this is the document I really wish somebody else had written, and I couldn't find it, so I ended up writing it. It's sort of the decryption key for how the heck to figure out when the government has the rights to release. And the basic answer is if the government has copyrights to it, and sometimes it does, or if the government has what's called unlimited rights, which often it does, then the government can actually release the software as open source software given certain other conditions, like it can't be classified or anything like that. And the contractors, again, if they have the rights, particularly if they have the copyright, typically can release as open source software as well. So basically, it turns out that in an amazing number of cases, by the way, that article is available online for free, either HTML and PDF. Basically, the government actually has, in a remarkable number of cases, the rights to do so. And I guess the third point actually is what I alluded earlier. There can't be some other reason it can't release it. So some software is what they call classify, secret, top secret. Some software is what they call expert controlled. And that kind of software, actually, not only can that not be released as open source software, that sort of software can't even normally be released as proprietary software. At least not without special restrictions. So, software, you don't want some of the special software that's really good at aiming a missile somewhere out to the general public. And I don't care what license it's under. But for a lot of software, the government doesn't have special needs for some software that, I want to distribute information to the public and I want to improve my website for doing so. And I figured out how to improve it. Let's get that changed back to the open source software project so that everybody can use that in the future and I don't have to pay the maintenance costs for it. Makes perfect sense. And not just the DoD, but lots of people.
Now, the people you've had the chance to actually chat with in the DoD about this, and you don't have to mention any names or anything, obviously, even if you could, I'm wondering, do they have the, knowing what you also know about the open source community, do they have the same sort of like, let's open source as much as we can attitude, or is this vary, or is it still pretty confusing to them?
All of the above, I guess.
Okay.
It varies. The experience varies a lot. There are some folks who really do, want to work with and are, I would say, at least in some cases, successful working out with the general community. There's a whole lot of work in the geospatial community. I should give a shout out to Delta 3D folks who've been developing engines to do simulations for training and such. So there are some folks who are knowledgeable, understand these issues, and then there's some, a lot of project managers, they didn't get where they are by developing big open source software projects. And so they often don't understand what this is all about, and that's a matter of getting them to understand it. I think you mentioned a lot of the technical folks, of course, do understand this. And so the good news is that they're talking up their chain to their managers saying, hey, would be a good idea. And the good news is that now, at least in the DoD, there's kind of top cover these policies saying, yes, it's okay. This is a perfectly reasonable approach in a lot of cases. And so, not that everything was going to be open sourced, but it's okay to use open source. It's okay to release open source. Here's some rules and guides, and off you go. Great. Simon?
Nope.
Uh-oh. Oh. Did he freeze?
Yeah, the camera switched to you, so I thought you were about to say something.
Hi, Simon.
I certainly can do. Shall we try that one again?
Yes. Go ahead.
Well, yes, actually, David. So I have a completely orthogonal question for you here. I know that you're very interested in open source licensing, and I've just got off an OSI board meeting. I was just reviewing the minutes there as you were speaking, in fact, and I would be very interested in what message you would send to the new OSI board that just took its seats today concerning open source licensing from the DoD's perspective. If there was one thing you could ask us to do, what would it be?
I can't speak for the DoD officially, but I can say for me personally, I would say, a continuing press, and OSI has actually done this already to some extent, a continuing press to encourage people to use a very short list of well-known, well-understood licenses. And in fact, I'll give you my list. Everybody has a slightly different list, but basically I would talk about the MIT, the BSD new, maybe I include the 2-clause BSD as well, LGPL, GPL, and I guess I include Apache 2.0 license as well. I realize OSI has already done some identification along those lines, but the big trouble with a lot of folks who do licensing is there's a lot of people who think that it's a great idea to write a new license. And as you're well aware of, but I fear some people who are listening aren't, basically an open source software license creates the set of rules that everyone has to follow. And a lot of these licenses that think they're open source software aren't actually, and even ones that are often incompatible. Whereas that set, generally you can combine software to make larger works. And that's really what makes this whole thing run, is being able to take software, combine it with other software that you've developed, that other people developed, into larger, interesting works. And this is actually one of the continuing problems that I have, is I constantly see yet another, not so much being developed inside the DoD at this point, but from outside, we like to use some software and it uses this odd license, or it's incompatible with the license of this other software we need to use, and we need to combine them together, and that's a big, big problem. I guess probably the other thing I'd beg for the OSI to do would be education. There's still a remarkable amount of just misunderstanding the basic level of what what the laws are about software or about open source software in general. I was at a NASA conference last week, and some NASA programmer said, "Oh, I'm going to use some public domain software like this software I just copied and pasted from a blog site." Now, just because it's posted on a blog site doesn't mean it's not copyrighted, which is what he meant. And basically, a whole lot of people just don't understand the basic rules. We don't need them to turn into lawyers, but just a very basic understanding of here's what you're allowed to do, here's what not allowed to do, here are what the basic licenses are and what they mean. The short list, I think that would be very, very helpful. There's probably some stuff on there already, but I'd like to see more, materials to help people get started.
Right. I seem to remember at the NASA conference you made some comments about NASA's open source license. I got the impression you weren't very excited by it. Do you want to explain your problem with it?
Sure. I'm excited, but only in the negative sense. I think it's a big problem. The NASA now. I do want to give credit, by the way. NASA many years ago was, starting from many years ago, realized that they were using open source software. They needed to release more of its software as open source. And so I really do want to give them credit. It's not just all negative news. The problem was that they decided that they were going to write their own special NASA license. And the NASA license, as it's currently written, is universally incompatible. Not only is it incompatible with all the other licenses, it's even incompatible with, say, a government employee's software. If a DoD employee wrote software, normally that would not be under copyright, at least in the U.S. But anybody else couldn't add that software to NASA licensed software. There's a weird quirk in the NASA license. This is a big problem that causes this. Basically, it says that only the original authors of the software can add any changes to the NASA software license. What that's meant is that for the software that NASA's released, most of it never gets any serious improvements. It may get a few little tweaks here and there, but it doesn't get. One of the major reasons to release as open source is to get other people to collaborate with you, and this license creates a fundamental incompatibility. Now, I've talked with some of the lawyers, but the reality is that no other government agency has decided it needs a weird special license. It's a vanity license, and I think that we need to admit that, hey, I'm glad that they are interested in open source, but we need to get rid of that license. Require projects to use special waivers. I would say improve that license just for the ones who are stuck with it, because sometimes it's easier to upgrade a license than to switch. But I'd like to see NASA primarily releasing open source software under standard normal licenses that the rest of the world uses. NASA has some other issues too. I mean, they're specific to NASA, but I think in general they need to make it a lot easier to release as open source software than they do now. Because in fact, there's a lot of great things that they do, and a lot more great things they could do if they fix the policies.
Yeah, I'm really very excited by the way they're following through with the OpenStack work. I think that the idea of NASA being one of the stakeholders behind OpenStack makes it a very interesting proposition in the open source space. Agreed. And that's OpenStack's just starting, and yet I think you can say in many ways it's already a success. Certainly, it's got a lot of buzz, a number of users, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. NASA's actually done a lot of interesting stuff, and it's kind of sad that so much of this is stuck under this, license that doesn't let anybody improve or change it unless you happen to be the original author, which is frankly minority. I should note, by the way, the NASA license has already been declared. The Free Software Foundation declares it as non-free. I know Fedora forbids it. And I think there are some other distributions which also forbid. So you've got NASA releasing software that's an open source software, but other projects explicitly forbidding its use or distribution as part of their distributions. And that's not because it's any problem with NASA, but because of problems with their license. So I'm really hoping that in the long term we can get this fixed.
I don't know where you stand on what I'm about to ask for the next question. It's sort of bad to ambush you with this, but I know that as I was discussing the show with some of the people in the chat room before the show and also with my friends a couple days ago, they were like, oh my God, so the DoD is using stuff like Perl, like libraries we've contributed to do what they do, which includes, killing people. That's, one of the aspects of things that go on in the Department of Defense. And I know that I remember seeing a number of years ago some ad hoc licenses, not licenses that would be OSI approved, but that had clauses in them, let's say, not to be used for military conflict or something like that. Do you have anything you could say to people who are concerned about their software being used for things that they're morally against?
Well, let's see. Obviously, I don't have a moral objection to the Department of Defense. I work with them. Yeah. And I should note, by the way, notice the term of its. Notice the name of the organization. The point of creating a military organization isn't actually to kill people. It's to protect the country and the interests of the country. And unfortunately, you need to have the threat of force to be able to be credible. Mm-hmm. It'd be a nice world where there were no weapons at all, but as soon as somebody creates a weapon, the other guys need weapons to defend themselves. And that's the world we actually live in. And, I don't live in this ideal world. I live in the actual world. Now, that said, let me point out that any license that restricts the use can't be an open source license because it says you can use it for any purpose. I like Linus's sharks with lasers. So mm-hmm. you can use it for putting on sharks with lasers on their heads. But before you scream too loudly, I should note that we're talking over a TCP/IP connection. And mm-hmm. TCP/IP was developed entirely with Department of Defense funds. So anybody who uses the internet is using stuff that was developed using government funds. And by the way, not only did the DoD fund it, the key thing that enabled the internet to exist was the release of the open source implementation in the BSDs of TCP/IP. Even those who don't use stacks built on it use the knowledge from those stacks to build their own stacks. So, whether or not you like it, the Department of Defense actually does a lot of good for a lot of folks, and if you're going, that's an important thing to know too.
That's an incredibly great answer to that. I'm sorry for ambushing you with the question, but I thought, people have asked me that, so I'd be amiss to not actually bring it up here. The other thing I was curious about. I believe that stuff created by the U.S. government, including the DOT, is all automatically in the public domain, correct? And if so, do they need to apply an open source license to the material they create themselves?
Oh, wonderful. I'm glad you asked me that because that turns out to be not quite true. So let me, I'm sorry to say, I'm not a lawyer, by the way, but I've had to learn a whole lot about the law. And I think anybody who's developing software needs to learn a little bit about the law because, you need to follow the rules. And in the case of government, it turns out that the government has the copyright for lots and lots of software. If an employee, and let me see if I can do this correctly, if an employee develops software, U.S. government employee develops software as part of their official duties, okay, then it is not subject to copyright in the United States. That's how it actually words. Now, there's all sorts of caveats. It actually can be copyrighted outside the U.S. I'm not sure that's such a good idea for a variety of reasons, but it can be copyrighted outside the U.S. The other issue is that it only applies to U.S. government employees as part of official duties. That would include a soldier. But, for example, a contractor is not a U.S. government employee. And almost all software done by government is actually not written by an employee. It's done under contract. And so it's a completely different set of rules. This only applies to the employees and only as part of their official duties. If some guy goes out at night and writes software that's not related to what they do as their day job, then again, it's not part of the official duties. That rule doesn't apply. So yes, there is such a rule, but there's a whole bunch of little asterisks afterwards that you have to be a little careful of. In the special case where where the entire program, every line of code is written by U.S. government officials as part of official duties, then it is not subject to copyright in the U.S. It can be subject to copyright outside the U.S., but it is not copyrighted in the U.S. So if and this has actually happened, for example, with the health VA software called Vista. not the Windows operating system, but Vista was, I believe, entirely developed by government employees, part of the official duties, so it's public domain. When they released it, there is no copyright on it inside the U.S. But as soon as you add even one line of code from somebody else, that line of code is, of course, subject to other rules, and that means the software as a whole, if there's part of it that's copyrighted, then the combination, I should go backwards. Whenever you take software, it's combined with lots of different pieces, you have to obey all the rules. So if one piece is copyrighted and other parts aren't, then the system as a whole, you have to treat as a copyrighted work because parts of it are, and you have to obey all the rules. Mm-hmm. So basically, there's a reason why people say that phrase, but because of these little asterisks and additions, it's a lot more complicated, and it turns out for a vast amount of software that the government develops, it's done by contractors, and so that rule just doesn't apply.
So it does actually make sense then to make sure that even if it's a government employee in the act of his work, writing software, every line of code coming out of his fingers, or wherever they come out from, maybe his head, wherever lines of code come from, that they still actually look at licensing the software under a compatible open source license, just so that we won't have that confusion about outside the U.S. or what happens when somebody else wants to adapt part of it.
That's right. That's right. I know of no reason, for example, you can't say, here's the license that applies outside the U.S. I've not double-checked that with lawyers. I've learned to always double-check things with lawyers, but I can't think of any reason offhand. In any case, what often happens is it's combined. SE Linux is an interesting case in point. I love to tell this story. Mm-hmm. A good portions of that software were written by government employees as part of their official duties. But it's actually more complicated. One of them, I can give names. Steve Smalley was a government employee, and when he wrote software as part of his official duties, that was not subject to copyright in the U.S. He then went outside the government and worked for a contractor for a while. During that, and kept writing software, that part was copyrighted. Then he went back to the government. So it's the same person, but who he worked for mattered as far as this regime. And I think in reality, a vast amount of government software has this combination of government and contractor. And that's okay. And there's nothing illegal about that at all. That just means that you have to obey all the rules. And so I think nowadays I don't have any stats, but I would expect that from nowadays, most software is this combination, and so you end up just simply saying, yes, it's parts of this are copyrighted, and so I'm going to treat the whole, I'm going to license as a whole under a particular open source software open source software license, because that means that I know what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not allowed to do.
Wow. This is a really fascinating subject. I'm sure we've only scratched the surface of it, and I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to try to enlighten us on some of these complex issues. And I know we'll probably have some listeners in the DoD that may go, oh my God, there's actually some position papers I can now follow and things like that. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. Is there anything we skipped over that you really want to make sure our audience knows before we have to let you go?
Oh, I'm sure I'll think of a whole bunch of things once we sign off.
Yeah, I know. That always works that way.
That always works that way. I guess, I already touched about the, please use a common license that everybody understands. I've done some work, my Look at the Numbers paper, which I intend to update recently, but basically there's lots of numbers that say, this is a reasonable thing to do. I guess I should probably make a pitch against a phrase I've heard a lot, but I think we need to stop using, and that's intellectual property. What I found is that as soon as people start using that phrase, they make all sorts of assumptions that aren't true. When you say property, most people think of things like cars. I took your car, you have no car. But software and data in general doesn't work like that. If I copy your software, well, wait a minute, you still have the software. It doesn't work at all like physical property. And I think we ought to be emphasizing phrases like intellectual rights and intellectual works, because then a lot of the confusions involving government contracts and what's government allowed to do, I found hinges on this theory that, well, wait a minute, I'm going to think about who owns what, who holds the copyrights. And usually it actually doesn't matter. What often matters is just who has which rights. And when you start asking, well, do I have the right to do this? What do I have the rights to do? You're actually way better off at least in the U.S. government, because you're starting to now ask the right questions instead of questions that frankly may not matter. And that's actually true in open source software in general. I don't even know who necessarily has all the copyrights to some of these large open source software projects, because they've got so many people who've worked on them. And yet all I really care about is, what rights do I have? Oh, and now I know.
So I get a lot of pushback from folks when because I agree with your point completely there, David. I get a lot of pushback when I say to people they shouldn't say intellectual property. So I don't actually fight the term. I just always substitute it out with the word they should have used, because they either mean copyright, patent, trademark, or trade secret. And so I simply don't reply back with intellectual property. I reply back and say, copyright this, or how do your patents apply, or whatever. Do you find you get a lot of pushback in the DoD when you try and snuff out the term intellectual property, or do you have a strategy for dealing with it?
Oh, I have no illusions that I have a magic wand. I'm going to stop everyone from using some phrase. But I think if some of us know, wait a minute, that's a misleading phrase, I'm going to use a different phrase. Even just simply a number of people using clearer phrases, clearer words is way more likely, and why they're doing it helps a lot in kind of getting that understanding, so that even if some people use a different phrase, okay, I know what you really meant, and you move on.
Wow, such a fascinating topic, as I said a few minutes ago. But I just want to again thank you for taking. There's a lot more, and I know that we're going to have like the URL for your website in the show notes. And I know I really encourage people to go read the rest of the material that we were just sort of skipping over in today's show, because you've got a lot of really good detailed points there and a lot of good intellectual aspects of all this stuff. So I want to thank you again, David, for coming on the show and talking about it.
Happy to do so.
Very good, very good. That was David A. Wheeler, because apparently there's a number of David Wheelers out there, and talking to us about open source software in the Department of Defense. Simon, what do you think?
I think that's a very interesting set of topics there, Randal.
Mm-hmm.
I've looked at procurement policies around the world with various governments, various defense departments, and I think that the work that the DoD has been doing is very well thought through. It's very low key and yet very effective, and I'm pretty impressed by the work they've been able to do. I had the privilege of being involved in the U.S. Air Force's work on open source a few years ago when I was working at Sun, and I was very impressed by the number of people there were in the DoD and the U.S. Air Force, and presumably in the Army as well, who have got a deep understanding of software freedom and are very keen to make it work for the U.S. Federal Republic.
It's really interesting that we get to use open source software now and really in every aspect of life. We're talking about, commercial software, commercial applications. We're talking about NGOs, and also now GEOs.
Yep.
What's the opposite of an NGO? I guess it'd be a GEO, right?
I was also very thrilled to hear that the NSA is using open source software. I look forward to being able to go back to Ian Watmore in the UK government and ask him if the software is so insecure, how come the NSA are using it?
Yeah, especially when they were able to take Linux and make it harden with the SE Linux project, which is really really great that they can able to contribute that back. And yeah, I know that there's been a lot of my friends that have sort of quietly talked to me, and I know that more than a few of them have actually been in organizations that have 3 letters. So it's very nice that we get some sort of public acknowledgement, at least in this realm as well. Speaking of public acknowledgement, there's my bad segue to my guest list. I was going to have some bad handoff here. So we've got a bunch of really cool people coming up in the Q2 here. I've got a bunch of slots already scheduled. We've got a few more coming up next week. Really looking forward to the show. Jason Huggins is going to talk to us. The creator of Selenium, which is the big web testing framework, is going to talk to us about Selenium and also about his project. SOS Labs, which is a commercialization of Selenium, so one of these really great models of being able to actually make money off this stuff and not just be a starving artist. We've got immediately after that we have we have Emil Ivov, I guess, who wrote Jitsi, which is formerly called SIP Communicator. It's the open source VoIP client that does both audio and video. Looking forward to that. Maybe tying that in with some of the shows we did recently. Philip Brown and Ben Walton are going to talk to us about OpenCSW, the open source packaging system for OpenSolaris. Simon, you might know a little bit about that, right?
I certainly remember doing the research that showed that it was time for a new packaging solution. You know, if you look at the work that's happened on APT, the work that's happened on the Red Hat and SUSE packaging activities, they were all designed in a day before you had virtualization and multiple virtual hosts running on the same operating system. And there is definitely a call for the ideas of how to manage the resources being used by multiple virtual machines by a package manager. So that was some of the thinking that went into that OpenSolaris package manager. I've not been keeping up with it, so I'll be very interested to find out just how far they've let those thoughts progress into real code.
Yeah, and one of my coworkers here at Media Temple actually has worked around Philip Brown for a while, so he says he's going to be a really interesting guest. So I'm looking forward to that one especially. We've also got Dustin Mitchell, I can't read my own writing here, working on the BuildBot project, which is a Python building system, deploying system. We've got Matthew Flatt, the Racket software, which is used to be called... Oh, and I'm not remember the name. It's the Scheme, SLT something, Scheme, whatever it is. It's a language for teaching kids programming, which I'm really looking forward to talking to as well. We also have, I'm going to mispronounce this too, Kosuke Kawaguchi, something like that. Kosuke Kawaguchi, who is the creator of what used to be called Hudson, now called Jenkins, which had a fork because of the whole Oracle Sun mismatch there. But Simon, you might have something to say about that too, but I'll just you can stay quiet for now. Curtis Jewell is save all your anger for later. Okay, Curtis Jewell is going to talk to us about Strawberry Perl, which is the version of Perl that runs on Windows, but has all the same normal features of being able to install your own CPAN modules, which unlike the version from Active State. A lot of other people on the short list. You can go to twit.tv/floss, and there's a spreadsheet linked from there that talks about all of our upcoming guests. And if you see somebody on, no, I did that wrong again. If somebody that you want on that list, have the project leader email me, merlin@stonehenge.com. That's how all these people got on there. You can also follow me on Twitter at Merlin, MERLYN. You can see that where I'm going to be and who I'm hanging out with and stuff. I'm also on about 17 other social sites. I've just been posting pictures to Pick Please, and I've been posting on my blog at merlin.posteros.com. And so there's just I'm all over the web. Just come find me that way. Next week, I'll be in Portland. I'll be recording the next show I'm going to do for Starship Sofa. If you haven't seen starshipsofa.com, I've been reading sci-fi stories for them as a reader. It's been a lot of fun for that. And that's all the things I want to plug today. Simon, where can we find you?
My plugging needs are much simpler than yours today, Randal. I just want to encourage every reader to go follow me on Twitter, where they'll find that I'm WebMink. And I'd like to encourage every listener to go visit my website, webmink.com, and go see the stuff that I'm talking about there, about open source procurement, about software patents, and Novell's acquisition by CPTN, a consortium run by Oracle, EMC, Apple, and Microsoft, and all of the other stuff that I'm writing about. I'm trying to write something substantial twice a week and something interesting every day. And I'd welcome readers on webmink.com, which you see there at the bottom of the screen if you're doing video, and which you'll just have to take careful note of if you're listening to the audio only.
Very good, very good. Well, that's a big challenge to write something, or at least something interesting every day. That's really cool. So glad that you're doing that. Very good. Anyway, I got you with a glass in your mouth. Okay, I was wondering where that pause was.
I would never do this, of course.
Well, Simon, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. I always find out a lot just listening to the way you're talking to the guests, because you have such an amazing background in open source advocacy and punditry that I really appreciate, again, that you being able to come on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to coming and harassing some of your future guests, Randal.
Very good, Simon. Thanks a lot. And, of course, speaking of future guests... Oh, wait, I did that already. That's not even a good segue now. Let's just get the heck out of the show. We'll see you all again next time on Floss Weekly.